Her plan was simple, if a little crazy. Pay a handsome stranger $1,000 to pose as her new boyfriend for one night. The goal, to shatter the smug, condescending smirk of her ex, a man who thought he'd left her with nothing. She just needed someone to look the part, to stand by her side and prove she'd moved on. What she found was a quiet, intense man in a worn-out jacket who needed the cash. But at the most opulent charity gala of the year, her carefully constructed charade implodes in a way she never imagined. Because her rented date wasn't just playing a part. He was a king in disguise, and she had just walked him straight into a war she had no idea how to fight. The invitation felt less like a request and more like a beautifully calligraphed dare. Embossed on thick, cream-coloured cardstock, the details for the annual Starlight Foundation Gala glittered under the fluorescent lights of Audrey Rowe's small design studio. It was the social event of the New York autumn season, a place where old money and new tech collided in a flurry of couture and champagne. It was also the place where he would be. Graeme Pembroke, her ex. The man who had meticulously dissected her dreams called her interior design business a cute little hobby, and then left her for Chloe Vanderbilt, a woman whose primary occupation was being a Vanderbilt. "You're not actually going, are you?" Jessica Chen, Audrey's best friend and occasional bookkeeper, asked, peering over her laptop. "That's not an invitation. It's a beautifully packaged panic attack." Audrey traced the gold lettering with her finger. "I have to, Jess. Rowe Designs donated a consultation package for the charity auction. It's a good networking opportunity." Jess snorted. "You hate networking. You want to see him. You want to walk in there with your head held high and a dress that makes him regret the day he learned to breathe." She wasn't wrong. The thought of Graeme seeing her successful and unbothered was a siren song she couldn't ignore. For 2 years he had been her world. He'd loved her ambition until it started to rival his own. He'd charmed her with tales of his future as a titan of private equity, a future in which she was meant to be a beautiful, supportive accessory. When she'd poured her life savings into starting Rowe Designs, he'd smiled that patronizing smile and said, "It's good to have a passion project." After he'd ended things via a curt, impersonal text message, she'd seen photos of him and Chloe in Vanity Fair 2 weeks later. The problem, as Jess had so astutely pointed out, was the head held high part. Going alone would make her look pitiful in his eyes. He would swoop in with his faux concern, Chloe clinging to his arm like a designer parasite, and he would kill her with kindness while his eyes screamed, "See, you can't manage without me." The idea, when it struck, was born of pure, undiluted desperation. It came to her 3 days before the gala while she was sitting in the Daily Grind, a coffee shop in Soho that was far too expensive, but made a latte that could momentarily solve all of life's problems. She was sketching a concept for a new client, trying to ignore the knot of dread in her stomach when a man walked in. He wasn't the usual Soho type. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit or trendy distressed sneakers. He wore scuffed work boots, faded jeans, and a simple, dark grey Henley that stretched across a broad chest and strong shoulders. There was a smudge of what looked like sawdust on his jawline. He was ruggedly handsome with intense, deep-set hazel eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once. He ordered a black coffee, no room for cream, and paid with a crumpled $10 bill. He sat at a small table near the window, pulling out a worn leather-bound notebook and a mechanical pencil. He wasn't on a phone. He was sketching. Intricate technical drawings of what looked like joinery or structural supports. He was focused, completely absorbed in his work. Audrey found herself staring. There was a quiet confidence about him, an aura of self-containment that was the complete antithesis of Graham's performative bravado. And then she overheard it. His phone buzzed, and he answered with a low, slightly rough voice. "Yeah." "No, the shipment of reclaimed oak was delayed again." "I know, but I'm not compromising on the materials. Look, I'm a little short on liquid funds until the trust clears next month. I'll figure it out. I always do." He hung up, letting out a frustrated sigh. Short on liquid funds. The insane, reckless movie plot idea solidified in her brain. It was idiotic. It was dangerous. It was perfect. Taking a deep breath, Audrey stood up, walked over to his table, and said the words that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. "Excuse me," she began, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is going to sound incredibly strange, but I have a business proposition for you." He looked up from his notebook, and those intense hazel eyes were even more piercing up close. He didn't smile. He just weighted his gaze, neutral, assessing. "I need to hire an escort for a gala on Saturday night." She blurted out, wincing at the word. Not for that. I just need a date, a fake boyfriend, someone to accompany me to an event. I'll pay you $1,000 for 5 hours of your time." He blinked slowly. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a flicker of amusement. "You want to pay me $1,000 to be your date?" Yes, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. There's someone I need to make an impression on. You're handsome. You look like you don't try too hard. You clean up well, I assume. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. The movement made his biceps strain against the sleeves of his shirt. And what makes you think I'd be good at this? What if I'm a terrible actor? The less you say, the better, Audrey said, her confidence growing. Just stand next to me, look vaguely admiringly at me, and if my ex approaches, be aloof and a little mysterious. Can you do aloof and mysterious? He considered this for a long moment. His eyes scanned her face, and she felt strangely exposed, as if he could see right through her flimsy bravado to the raw hurt underneath. What's your name? He asked, his voice a low baritone. Audrey Rowe. Nathaniel. But I go by Nate. He extended a hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. And what's the story? What do I do for a living? She hadn't thought that far ahead. Something impressive but niche, so he can't ask too many follow-up questions. You're an antiquarian horologist. You restore rare antique clocks. It was the most obscure, ridiculous thing she could think of. A genuine smile finally broke through his stoic expression, transforming his face. It was a stunning, disarming smile. An antique clock restorer. Okay. And how did we meet? Through a mutual friend, at a wine tasting in the Finger Lakes. Very romantic. He nodded slowly. $1,000 you said cash, 500 up front, 500 at the end of the night. He looked down at his notebook, then back at her. The amusement was still in his eyes, but there was something else there too, curiosity. All right, Audrey Rowe, you've got yourself a date. But on one condition. What's that? I buy my own suit? You can't have your fake clock-restoring boyfriend showing up in a rental. He pulled a pen from his pocket. Give me your number. I'll text you about measurements. As she walked out of the coffee shop, her own number scribbled on a napkin in his hand, Audrey felt a dizzying mix of terror and triumph. She had just hired a complete stranger, a construction worker or a carpenter, to go up against Graeme Pembroke in the heart of Manhattan high society. It was the stupidest, most impulsive thing she had ever done, and she couldn't wait. The 3 days leading up to the gala were a blur of anxious preparation. Audrey bought a dress, a deep emerald silk gown that was more expensive than her monthly rent, but clung to her curves in a way that screamed confidence. She had her hair and makeup professionally done. She was building her armor for the battle to come. Nate, true to his word, handled his own attire. He texted her for his measurements with a disarming straightforwardness, and then went silent for 2 days. Audrey was half convinced he wouldn't show up, that he'd take the $500 she'd wired him as an advance and disappear, leaving her stranded and humiliated. But on Saturday evening at precisely 7 o'clock, the buzzer to her apartment rang. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing in her hallway was Nate, but it wasn't the man from the coffee shop. The rugged carpenter had been replaced by a man of breathtaking elegance. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made his shoulders look even broader. His hair was slightly tamed, his jaw was clean-shaven, and the only remnants of his former appearance were the intensity in his hazel eyes and an expensive-looking yet understated watch on his wrist. It wasn't flashy, but it looked solid, heavy, and real. He looked less like a hired date and more like he owned the entire building. Wow, Audrey breathed out. The suit, it's perfect. I clean up okay, he said, his lips twitching into that small smile. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering for a moment. And you, Audrey Rowe, look like you're about to start a war. Just a small one, she replied, grabbing her clutch. The ride to the venue, a lavishly decorated ballroom at the Pierre Hotel, was surprisingly comfortable. Nate didn't ask too many questions. He simply let her brief him. His name is Graeme Pembroke, she explained, twisting the strap of her clutch. He'll be with Chloe Vanderbilt. He's tall, unfairly handsome, and has this way of smiling at you like he's just forgiven you for being an idiot. He'll try to get under your skin. Your job is to be unimpressed. Unimpressed. Got it, Nate said, his eyes on the glittering Manhattan skyline. And I'm Nate the horologist. Right. And if he asks about your work, just say it's highly technical and involves a lot of German-made tools. That'll shut him up. When they arrived, the scene was even more intimidating than Audrey had imagined. Flashbulbs went off as society figures stepped out of black cars. Inside, the air hummed with power and wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Audrey's confidence wavered, but then Nate placed a firm, warm hand on the small of her back. You've got this, he murmured, his voice close to her ear. The simple gesture was grounding a silent anchor in a sea of judgment. They made their way through the crowd, accepting glasses of champagne from a passing waiter. Nate moved with an easy grace that belied his coffee shop persona. He didn't gawk at the opulence. He seemed completely at ease, as if this were his natural habitat. People looked at him, their gazes filled with curiosity. Who was this handsome unknown man with Audrey Rowe? It didn't take long to find them. Graeme and Chloe were holding court near the silent auction tables. Graeme, in his custom Tom Ford tux, looked every bit the master of the universe. Chloe was preening in a gaudy, feather-covered dress. Graeme saw her first. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, taking in her dress, her confidence, and most of all the man standing beside her. He whispered something to Chloe, and the two of them started gliding their way over their smiles wide and predatory. Audrey, I wasn't sure you'd make it, Graeme said, his voice oozing feigned delight. He kissed the air next to her cheek. You look... well. The subtext was clear. You look well for someone I discarded. Graeme. Chloe. Lovely to see you, Audrey said, her voice steadier than she expected. Graeme's eyes immediately shifted to Nate, sizing him up with a look that was pure condescending appraisal. And you are? Nate didn't offer his hand. He simply gave a slight nod. Nate. Nate, Graeme repeated, tasting the name. Audrey, you must introduce us properly. What does Nate do? Here it was. The moment of truth. Nate's a horologist, Audrey said smoothly. Graeme's brow furrowed. A what? He restores antique timepieces, Audrey explained. Graeme let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Clocks? How? Quaint. Is there much of a market for that these days? Nate, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm and level, yet it cut through Graeme's smugness like a knife. It's a niche market, but the clients are discerning. They value craftsmanship and history over disposable trends. Much like architecture, wouldn't you agree? A Patek Philippe from 1950 has more integrity than 1,000 glass and steel monstrosities thrown up in a year. He glanced meaningfully around the historic ballroom. Graeme was taken aback. He fancied himself a connoisseur of luxury, but he was clearly out of his depth. He didn't know how to respond to such a specific, confident assertion. Right, Graeme stammered, recovering. Well, we're all so happy you're... Moving on, Audrey. Chloe and I were just saying how important it is for people to find their own level. The insult was delivered with a perfect smile. Before Audrey could retort, an older, distinguished-looking man with a mane of silver hair approached their group. His eyes lit up when he saw Nate. Nate. My boy. What in God's name are you doing here? The man boomed, clapping Nate on the shoulder with genuine affection. I thought you'd gone off the grid. Last I heard you were in Wyoming building a cabin with your bare hands. Audrey froze. Graeme and Chloe turned to look at the newcomer. Audrey recognized him from the business pages. Walter Finch, the legendary founder of Finch Industries, a corporate titan worth billions. Nate smiled that rare, genuine smile. Walter, good to see you. Just taking a break? Enjoying the city? Walter Finch laughed. A break? Son, you sell your company for $3 billion. You're allowed more than a break. You're allowed to buy your own planet. He then turned his attention to the stunned group. Don't tell me you folks don't know who this is. This is Nathaniel Callaway, the man behind Callaway Dynamics, the one who revolutionized data encryption. He's the reason half the people in this room can do their banking securely. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Audrey stared at Nate, her mind refusing to process the words. Nathaniel Callaway, Callaway Dynamics, $3 billion, the sawdust on his jaw, the worn-out jacket, the need for $1,000. It didn't make any sense. Graeme's face had gone completely pale, the color draining from his cheeks as if he'd seen a ghost. His smug superiority evaporated, replaced by a look of horrified disbelief. Chloe Vanderbilt looked from Graeme to Nate, her perfectly painted mouth hanging slightly agape. Walter Finch, oblivious to the drama he had just detonated, clapped Nate on the back again. Well, don't be a stranger, son. We need to talk about my foundation's new tech initiative. He nodded at the group and moved on. An excruciating silence descended. Nate looked at Audrey, his expression unreadable. He had known this could happen. He had played his part, and now the curtain had been pulled back. Graeme was the first to speak, his voice a choked whisper. Callaway. The Nathaniel Callaway. Nate's gaze shifted to him, and it was cold as ice. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he looked at Audrey, his voice softening slightly. Are you ready to go? I think we've made the impression you were hoping for. He placed his hand on her back again, a gesture of ownership and protection that was no longer part of the act. As he guided her away, leaving Graeme and Chloe standing there like statues, Audrey could feel every eye in the room on them. She had wanted to upset her ex. She had wanted to make him feel small. But she had just dropped a nuclear bomb on his entire world, and she had no idea who the man holding her was or what kind of fallout was coming her way. The silence in the back of the town car was heavier than the city air. Audrey sat rigidly on the plush leather seat, staring at her hands, her mind reeling. The emerald dress suddenly felt like a cheap costume. The entire night, her meticulously planned revenge had been a farce built on a foundation she hadn't understood. Nathaniel Calloway. She replayed their first meeting in her head. The scuffed boots, the talk of being short on funds, the easy acceptance of her $1,000 offer. It was a performance, a masterful one. He hadn't lied to her, not directly. He had simply allowed her to believe the narrative she had created for him. Why, she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you do that? The money? It was a joke to you. Nate was looking out the window, his jaw tight. It wasn't a joke, and your situation didn't feel like a joke. He turned to face her, his hazel eyes serious. I sold my company 6 months ago. Since then, every single person I've met knows my net worth before they know my name. They don't see me. They see a walking, talking bank account. Women, old friends, business associates. It's all transactional. They all want something. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. You walked up to me in that coffee shop and you didn't see a billionaire. You saw a guy in a work shirt who you thought you could trust to have your back for a night. You offered me a deal. A straightforward, honest transaction. It was the most real conversation I'd had in months. I was intrigued. Intrigued? Audrey's voice rose, a bubble of hysteria rising in her chest. You were intrigued, Nate. You let me walk you into that gala like a show pony. I was trying to prove I wasn't a fool who'd been dumped by a rich guy, and I did it by hiring a man who could buy Graham's entire company with his pocket change. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? More humiliating than him seeing you alone and miserable? Nate countered, his voice remaining level. Audrey, your plan worked. You wanted to get under his skin. You wanted to prove you'd moved on to bigger and better things. Mission accomplished, I'd say. That's not the point. She shot back. The point is, it was all a lie, and not even my lie. It was yours. My privacy is not a lie, he said, his tone hardening slightly. I was renovating an old brownstone I own in the village. By myself. I like working with my hands. It's real. The trust fund I have for my personal projects hadn't cleared yet, and I was genuinely short on liquid cash for a shipment of materials. Your $1,000 was going to pay for it. She stared at him dumbfounded. A billionaire who did his own construction and had cash flow problems. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel. The car pulled up outside her modest apartment building. The spell of the tuxedo and the town car was broken. This was her reality, a fourth-floor walk-up and a business she was struggling to keep afloat. Keep the other $500, she said numbly, grabbing her clutch and moving to open the door. Nate's hand shot out gently, touching her arm. Audrey. Wait. She stopped, but she didn't look at him. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you, he said, and his voice was sincere. That wasn't my intention. I enjoyed tonight, before Walter showed up anyway. I enjoyed being your horologist. She finally turned to look at him. In the dim light of the car, she could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't the untouchable titan Graeme saw. He was just a man, albeit a ridiculously complicated and wealthy one. Good night, Nate, she said softly, and got out of the car before she could do something stupid like cry. She didn't hear from him for 2 days. She tried to throw herself back into work, but her mind kept replaying the scene at the gala. The look on Graham's face was seared into her memory, a cocktail of shock, fury, and utter humiliation. A small vindictive part of her was thrilled, but a much larger part was terrified. Graeme Pembroke was not a man who took humiliation well. He was a predator, and she had wounded his pride. Wounded predators were the most dangerous. The first shot was fired on Tuesday morning. Audrey was in a meeting with Mr. Peterson, the head of development for a boutique hotel chain. The Peterson project was her biggest contract to date, the one that would finally put Row Designs on the map and out of the red. They were in the final stages of approving her designs for the hotel's lobby and suites. Mr. Peterson, who had always been warm and enthusiastic, was suddenly distant and evasive. Audrey, we have to talk, he said, avoiding her eyes. There's been a change of plans. We're putting the project on hold indefinitely. Audrey's blood ran cold. On hold, but we were about to sign the final papers. What happened? Is it a budget issue? It's more of a risk management issue, Peterson said, shuffling papers on his desk. Our primary investors, a private equity firm called Pembroke Capital, have raised some concerns. They flagged your company as a potential liability. Something about your financial instability and lack of a long-term track record. Pembroke Capital. Graham's firm. The air left her lungs. My financials are solid for a new business, she argued, her voice trembling slightly. You've seen my books. You know my work. My hands are tied, Audrey Peterson said, his voice full of false sympathy. Pembroke's group is the majority investor. Their word is final. I'm truly sorry. Audrey walked out of the high-rise office building in a daze. The bustling New York street seemed to fade into a dull roar. This wasn't just a setback, it was a kill shot. The Peterson project was 90% of her projected income for the next year. Without it, her business would be bankrupt in 6 months. Graeme hadn't just gotten angry. He had declared war. He hadn't come after her personally. He'd targeted the one thing that meant more to her than anything, her dream, her independence. He was going to dismantle her life piece by piece just to prove that he could. That evening, sitting in her studio surrounded by blueprints and fabric samples that were now meaningless, she finally let the tears fall. She had won the battle at the gala, but she was about to lose everything that mattered. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I heard about the Peterson contract. Don't panic, he's made a mistake." And she stared at the message, a fresh wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. Anger, resentment, and a tiny, treacherous spark of hope. Nathaniel Calloway had dropped a bomb into her life and walked away. Now he was back acting like he could fix it with a text message. She didn't want his help. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want a billionaire savior. But as she looked at the stack of unpaid invoices on her desk, she had to face a terrifying truth: she might not have a choice. Audrey didn't reply to Nate's text. Pride, stubborn and fierce, wouldn't let her. This was her fight. She had started it with her desperate, foolish plan, and she would finish it. She spent the next 3 days in a frantic state of damage control. She called every potential client in her Rolodex, followed up on old leads, and tried to downsize her project budgets. But the industry was small. The news about the Peterson contract withdrawal, especially the whispers of financial instability, had spread like poison. Doors that were once open were now politely but firmly closed. On the 4th day, when she was surviving on coffee and despair, her office buzzer rang. Expecting a courier with another return sample book, she buzzed them up without asking who it was. A few moments later, there was a soft knock on her studio door. It was Nate. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a work shirt. He was dressed in dark, well-fitting jeans, a simple black sweater, and a leather jacket. He looked casual, but the air of quiet power was still there. In his hands, he held 2 large cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled deliciously of fresh pastries. "I figured you could use this," he said, his expression neutral. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, placing the coffee and bag on her large drafting table, his eyes taking in the chaotic state of her studio. He saw the piles of paperwork, the frantic sketches for non-existent projects. He saw her exhaustion. "I told you not to panic," he said gently. "And I'm not panicking," Audrey retorted, crossing her arms defensively. "I'm strategizing, and I don't need you to bring me pity coffee." "It's not pity coffee," he said, pushing one of the cups towards her. "It's you're going to burn yourself out coffee. And a croissant. You look like you haven't eaten." She wanted to throw him out. She wanted to scream at him for his role in this mess. But she was so tired, and the smell of the coffee was a siren's call. She reluctantly took the cup. "What do you want, Nate? I want to help," he said simply. "I don't want your money," she snapped. "You can't just buy me a new contract. That would prove Graeme right, that I need a rich man to solve my problems." "I agree," he said, surprising her. He sat on the edge of her drafting table, a clear violation of her personal space, yet it didn't feel threatening. "Throwing money at this is lazy. And it's not what you need. You need an opportunity, not a handout. You need to win on your own merits." She looked at him confused. "So why are you here?" "Because Graeme isn't playing fair. He's using leverage and lies to shut you down. I'm just going to level the playing field." He pulled out his phone. "I did some digging. Pembroke Capital doesn't just invest in hotel chains. One of their biggest partners is a media conglomerate that owns several high-profile design and architecture magazines. Graeme is ensuring that not only can you not get work, but no one will even see the work you've already done." Audrey sank into her chair, the weight of it all crashing down on her. He was strangling her career from every conceivable angle. "What can I do?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "You can let me make a phone call," Nate said, not as a billionaire throwing his weight around, but as someone who knows people who value talent over petty grudges, people who Graeme can't touch. She hesitated. It felt like a surrender. "Audrey," Nate said, his voice soft but firm. "Men like Graeme count on their victims being too proud or too scared to fight back with the same weapons. He's using his network. It's time you used one too. Let me be your network." She looked into his eyes and saw no pity. She saw respect. She saw a partner offering a tool, not a prince offering a rescue. With a slow, reluctant nod, she gave him her consent. Nate made the call right there in her studio. He didn't pace or raise his voice. He just spoke in low, confident tones to someone he called Robert. He didn't mention Graeme or the sabotage. He simply talked about an incredibly gifted interior designer named Audrey Rowe, whose innovative work on a new hotel concept he'd seen. He mentioned her fresh perspective on sustainable luxury and her unique aesthetic. He made her sound like the future of the industry. Robert's the head of acquisitions for the Sovereign Group, Nate explained after he hung up. They're a global hospitality giant. They're launching a new line of ultra-luxury eco-lodges. They've been looking for a designer who can bring a unique vision to the table, someone not from the usual pool of established names. He's going to look at your online portfolio tonight. The Sovereign Group. Audrey gasped. They were legendary. Working for them was a career-making dream. They'll never hire me. I'm too small. Let them be the judge of that, Nate said. He took a bite of a pastry from the bag. In the meantime, I saw the blueprints for the Peterson project you had pinned to the wall. The atrium design using the reclaimed wood and the living wall. It's brilliant, but you have a structural flaw in the load-bearing calculations for the central staircase. Audrey stared at him. What? How would you know that? He walked over to the blueprints, pointing with his finger. This support here. You're using a standard 10-inch beam, but with the type of wood you've specified, and the cantilevered design, you'll get micro fractures within 5 years. You need to reinforce it with a concealed steel I-beam or switch to a laminated veneer lumber. I'd recommend the latter for the aesthetic. She looked at her own designs, then at him, her mind spinning. He wasn't just a tech genius, the man who sketched in the coffee shop, the man renovating his own brownstone. It wasn't a hobby. He understood this on a level she hadn't expected. My degree was in structural engineering, he said, answering her unspoken question. Before I got sidetracked with coding. Old habits. Over the next week, an unspoken routine developed. Nate would show up at her studio in the late afternoon, coffee in hand. He wouldn't interfere, but he'd sit and work on his own laptop, managing his vast invisible empire, she presumed, while she obsessively refined her portfolio. When she got stuck on a technical problem, she would ask, and he would offer a solution with quiet, devastating competence. He wasn't just a silent guardian, he was becoming a collaborator. They talked. She told him about her passion for design, how she loved creating spaces that made people feel something. He told her about the crushing pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar company, the isolation at the top, and his profound need to build something tangible with his own hands again. He was funny, surprisingly down to earth, and a ridiculously good listener. The line between gratitude and something deeper began to blur. Then, on a Friday afternoon, she got the email. It was from Robert Sterling at the Sovereign Group. They had been exceptionally impressed with her portfolio. They wanted to fly her to their headquarters in Chicago next week to present a preliminary concept for their flagship eco lodge in Costa Rica. She had an audience. She had a chance. She looked across the studio at Nate, who was concentrating on his screen. The raw, desperate anger she had felt towards him had been replaced by a confusing, heart-thumping warmth. He had leveled the playing field, just as he'd promised. He had given her a weapon to fight back. But as she booked her flight to Chicago, a cold dread settled in her stomach. Graeme wasn't a man who accepted defeat. When he found out she had bypassed his blockade, he wouldn't just be angry. He would be incandescent with rage. This wasn't the end of the war. It was just the beginning of a much deadlier battle. The week in Chicago was a whirlwind. Audrey poured every ounce of her talent and energy into her presentation for the Sovereign Group. She barely slept, fueled by the same coffee and adrenaline that had gotten her through her final exams in design school. She was competing against 2 other much larger firms, but Nate's quiet confidence had become a mantra in her mind. Let them be the judge of that. When she stood before the board of directors, a panel of stern-faced executives, she didn't talk about fabrics and color palettes. She talked about her philosophy. She spoke of creating a space that felt like it grew out of the Costa Rican jungle itself, using locally sourced materials, sustainable energy, and a design that blurred the line between indoors and outdoors. She presented sketches, 3D renderings, and a budget so meticulously planned it left no room for doubt. She flew back to New York in a state of suspended animation, not knowing if she had succeeded or failed. Nate met her at the airport. He didn't ask how it went. He just took her bag, guided her to his waiting car, a surprisingly understated black Audi, not a flashy supercar, and drove her home. The simple, solid presence of him was the only thing keeping her anxiety at bay. 2 days later, the call came. Robert Sterling from Sovereign offered her the contract. Not just for the flagship lodge, but for the entire line of 5 eco-resorts being built over the next 3 years. It was a multi-million-dollar deal that would not only save her company, but catapult it into the global elite. When she told Nate, his smile was one of pure, unadulterated pride. "I knew you could do it," he said. And in that moment, the last of her reservations about him melted away. He pulled her into a hug, and she buried her face in his shoulder, laughing and crying at the same time. The hug lingered, transforming from celebratory to something more intimate, more charged. When they finally pulled apart, the space between them was electric. The fake relationship had somewhere along the way become terrifyingly real. But their celebration was short-lived. The news of Audrey's contract with Sovereign sent shockwaves through the industry, and it didn't take long for Graeme to hear about it. His reaction was swift and vicious. He couldn't attack her financially anymore. Sovereign's legal and financial teams were impenetrable fortresses. So he decided to attack the only thing he had left: her reputation. A week after she signed the contract, a story appeared on Urban Gaze, a popular and notoriously ruthless industry blog. The headline was explosive: newcomer designer Audrey Rowe accused of corporate espionage and fraud. The article, citing anonymous sources close to the situation, painted a sickening picture. It claimed Audrey had stolen key design concepts for the Sovereign project from her previous work with the Peterson Hotel Group. It insinuated that she had falsified parts of her portfolio and used a wealthy benefactor to improperly influence the Sovereign board. It was a character assassination skillfully written to sound plausible, filled with just enough industry jargon to seem credible. It didn't mention Graeme or Nate by name, but the implications were crystal clear. The fallout was immediate. Audrey's phone blew up with calls from reporters. Her email inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, but many filled with vitriol. The comments on the blog post were a cesspool of accusations and judgment. Sovereign's PR department called, assuring her they stood by her, but warning her that the board was concerned about the negative press. This was Graeme's endgame. He couldn't destroy her business, so he was going to destroy her name, her credibility, the very essence of her talent. He was poisoning her dream, making her victory feel like a crime. Audrey was shattered. She locked herself in her studio, unable to face the world. This time, when Nate arrived, she didn't even have the strength to be angry. She just sat on the floor, the hateful words of the article glowing on her laptop screen. Nate read the article, his expression growing darker with every sentence. When he finished, he didn't offer words of comfort. He radiated a cold, controlled fury that was more frightening than any outburst. "This is no longer about his pride," Nate said, his voice dangerously low. "This is libel. He's crossed a legal and ethical line, and he's done it publicly." "What can I do? It's my word against his anonymous sources," Audrey said, her voice hoarse. "You're going to do nothing," Nate replied, pulling out his phone. "You're going to sit here, drink some water, and start sketching ideas for Costa Rica. I'm going to end this." His tone left no room for argument. Audrey watched as he made a series of quiet, efficient calls. He wasn't talking to lawyers. He was talking to people she'd never heard of: a digital forensics expert named Spider, a former journalist named Anya, and finally, a man he addressed only as Mr. Davenport. The next afternoon, Nate came to her apartment. "There's a meeting," he said. "You need to be there." The meeting was held in a glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor of a skyscraper in the financial district. It was the headquarters of Pembroke Capital. When they walked in, Graeme was already there, flanked by two of his firm's senior partners. One of them was a stern, silver-haired man who Nate greeted as Mr. Davenport. Graeme looked shocked and furious to see Audrey and Nate. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private firm matter." "It is," Mr. Davenport said, his voice like gravel, "and your recent actions have made Miss Rowe's business our business. Please sit." What followed was not a shouting match, but a clinical, brutal execution. Nate didn't speak at first. He simply placed a tablet on the polished mahogany table and nodded to Mr. Davenport. On the screen was a detailed report. Graeme, Mr. Davenport began, his eyes fixed on his subordinate. "We've been made aware of certain extracurricular activities you've engaged in. For instance, the pressure you exerted on the Peterson Hotel Group to terminate their contract with Rowe Designs. We have sworn affidavits from two of their board members who are concerned about the potential legal blowback." Graeme's face went rigid. "Then there's this," Davenport continued, tapping the screen. "An article filled with baseless and defamatory accusations. Our forensic tech team, with a little help from Mr. Calloway's associate, traced the original IP address of the anonymous source who fed the story to the blog. It came from a temporary office you rented under a false name 2 blocks from here. We also have the full, unredacted email chain between you and the blogger, including your payment transfers." Nate finally spoke, his voice calm and deadly. "You didn't just libel Miss Rowe. You used company resources and your position at Pembroke Capital to wage a personal vendetta. You exposed this entire firm to a massive lawsuit, not to mention the reputational damage. Sovereign Group's legal team was preparing to file an injunction this afternoon that would have named Pembroke Capital as a co-conspirator. I convinced them to wait until after this meeting." Graeme looked like he had been physically struck. He stared at Nate, then at Audrey, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. He had been so focused on ruining her that he never considered she had a protector who could ruin him 10 times over. He thought Nate was just money. He didn't realize Nate was strategy, information, and power. "You're finished here, Graeme," Mr. Davenport said coldly. "Your resignation is effective immediately. We'll be generous and allow you to state you're leaving to pursue other opportunities. In return, you will issue a full public retraction and apology to Miss Rowe, and you will never contact her or interfere with her business again. If you refuse, Mr. Calloway will release his findings to the press, and our firm will sue you personally for damages. Is that clear?" Defeated, exposed, and utterly broken Graeme Pembroke could only nod. He couldn't even look at Audrey as he stood up and walked out of the room, a titan reduced to a disgraced employee. As they rode the elevator down in silence, Audrey looked at Nate. He had just systematically dismantled a man's entire career, not with rage, but with cold, irrefutable facts. He had protected her, not by hiding her, but by unmasking her attacker for the entire world to see. "It's over," he said, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through hers. She knew it was. The war was won. And now for the first time she could look at the man beside her, not as a stranger, a client, or a protector, but as the person she was falling in love with. In the weeks that followed, Graeme's public retraction and silent disappearance from the New York financial scene, a quiet calm settled over Audrey's life. The venomous blog post was replaced by an article praising her resilience and talent. The industry, ever fickle now, saw her as a rising star who had overcome a malicious rival. The contract with the Sovereign Group was her shield and her vindication, but the victory felt hollow without acknowledging the man who had orchestrated it. Her relationship with Nate existed in a strange limbo. He had become her confidant, her advisor, and her fiercest defender, but the foundation of their connection was still a lie, a $1,000 transaction in a coffee shop. The fake boyfriend had become a real protector, but what came next? One crisp autumn evening, Nate took her to the brownstone in Greenwich Village he was renovating. The exterior was classic New York, but inside it was a work in progress. The walls were stripped down to the original brick, the floors were bare planks of wide oak, and the air smelled of sawdust and fresh plaster. It was a beautiful, chaotic, promising mess. "This is it," he said, gesturing around the cavernous main floor. "This is my escape. When running Callaway Dynamics felt like I was living in a spreadsheet, I'd come here and remember what it felt like to build something real." He showed her his planned sketches that were as detailed and passionate as her own design renderings. He'd preserved the historic details, the crown molding the original fireplace, while designing a modern, open-concept living space with a 2-story library and a glass-walled garden room. "It's incredible, Nate," she said, genuinely awed. "It's a home." "It's a house," he corrected her gently. "It's not a home yet. It's missing something." He turned to face her, the evening light from the large uncovered windows casting long shadows around them. "It's missing you." Audrey's heart skipped a beat. "Audrey, everything that's happened between us started with a business deal," he said, his voice earnest. "It was a lie to fool Graeme, but somewhere along the way it became the truest thing in my life. I'm not interested in being your guardian or your benefactor. I want to be your partner. I want to wake up with you, argue about blueprints with you, and build a life with you right here in this beautiful mess." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of fear or frustration. They were tears of overwhelming relief and happiness. "I was so afraid," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I was afraid that this was all just a game to you, another problem for the billionaire to solve. The only problem I was trying to solve was how to get the brilliant, fiery designer from the coffee shop to see me as just Nate," he said, stepping closer and framing her face with his hands. "Not Nathaniel Callaway, just Nate. The guy who really needed $1,000 for his reclaimed oak." She laughed through her tears. "You're an idiot." "I'm your idiot," he whispered, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, uncertain kiss. It was a kiss filled with all the unspoken words, the shared anxieties, and the quiet moments of connection they had shared over the past few months. It was a kiss that felt like a foundation being laid solid and true. In the months that followed, they didn't just build a house, they designed a life. Audrey brought her expertise to the brownstone, softening Nate's stark structural plans with warmth, color, and texture. She filled the space with light and life. In turn, Nate became an invaluable partner in her business, not with his money, but with his sharp strategic mind and unwavering belief in her talent. Rowe Designs flourished landing projects based purely on its own merit, with Audrey Rowe's name becoming synonymous with innovation and integrity. She had started with a desperate plan to borrow a stranger to upset her ex. She thought she was renting an actor for a night, a temporary shield against her own insecurity. What she found was a partner who didn't just protect her from the storm, but taught her how to build a shelter of her own, a man who saw her not as a project to be saved, but a design to be treasured. Standing with him in their finished home sunlight streaming through the windows, Audrey knew she hadn't just found a new life, she had built one from the ground up. And so Audrey's story comes to a close. It began with a simple, desperate act, a woman trying to reclaim her power from a man who had taken it. But it evolved into something so much more. It's a reminder that sometimes our most impulsive decisions, the ones born from rock bottom, can lead us to unexpected and beautiful places. It shows us that true strength isn't about the absence of fear, but about taking action despite it. And it proves that the best kind of partner isn't one who slays your dragons for you, but one who hands you a sword and helps you fight them yourself. What did you think of Audrey's journey? Could you ever imagine doing what she did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of drama twists and finding love in the most unlikely of circumstances, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with a friend who loves a good story, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. Thank you for listening.
He stood in the center of the room, a king in his custom-tailored suit, holding his friends captive with a story. His voice, slick with expensive scotch and self-importance, carried across the marble floor. Honestly, he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, divorcing her was the best business decision I ever made. It was like cutting loose dead weight, an anchor of mediocrity. His friends chuckled along their eyes, scanning the opulent art gallery for his ex-wife, the subject of their ridicule. They were all waiting for the punchline. They just didn't know the punchline was about to walk through the door and obliterate his entire world. The Blackwood Gallery's annual charity gala was the apex of the New York City social calendar, a place where old money and new tech collided in a supernova of champagne bubbles and feigned smiles. Julian Croft belonged here. He moved through the crowd, not like a guest, but like a proprietor, his hand casually clapping the shoulders of tech billionaires and his smile flashing at the wives of senators. At 35, he had a jawline that seemed carved from granite, a portfolio that swelled with every market fluctuation, and a ruthlessness he disguised as ambition. Tonight, he was in his element holding court near a towering abstract sculpture that cost more than a suburban home. His audience consisted of Mark, a hedge fund manager with a nervous twitch, and Mark's wife, Jessica, a woman whose face was a testament to the miracles of modern dermatology. I'm telling you, Julian continued, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Amelia had zero drive, a pretty face, sure, but no killer instinct. In my world, if you're not moving forward, you're a liability. But she was an artist, wasn't she? Jessica offered, dabbing her lips with a napkin. I remember her paintings. They were nice. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. Nice doesn't pay for a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Jessica. Nice is a hobby. I needed a partner, an asset, not a charity case who spent her days smearing paint on a canvas. The cruelty in his words was casual practiced. He had refined his narrative of their divorce over the past year until it was smooth and seamless. In his version, he was the magnanimous husband who had tried to elevate his simple small-town wife only to be dragged down by her lack of ambition. He was the victim who had finally broken free. So, is she coming tonight? Mark asked, his eyes darting toward the grand entrance. I thought Blackwood was a fan of her early work. Julian's smile tightened. Oh, I doubt it. This isn't her scene anymore. She probably couldn't afford a ticket for one. And secondly, he leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Who would she even come with? Last I heard, she was selling charcoal sketches in a coffee shop in Brooklyn. It's tragic, really. He took a long, slow sip of his scotch, the very picture of condescending pity. He had built his new life on the ashes of their old one, and it was crucial that everyone saw him as the victor. The narrative had to be controlled. His success had to be juxtaposed against her failure. He had left her with almost nothing in the divorce, invoking a cleverly worded prenuptial agreement his lawyers had drafted. He got the penthouse, the art collection they'd acquired together, mostly with her eye and his money, and the freedom to craft the story. She got a small lump sum that would barely cover a year's rent in the city, and her own broken dreams. He felt a surge of satisfaction. He had won, utterly and completely. He looked towards the grand arched doorway, half hoping she would appear just so he could see the look on her face when she realized how far she had fallen and how high he had soared. He wanted a public confirmation of his triumph. Unbeknownst to him, the universe was about to grant his wish, but in a way, his carefully curated ego could never have anticipated. The doors of the Blackwood Gallery swung open, and for a moment Amelia Vance felt like a ghost. She had once walked into rooms like this on Julian's arm, her dress carefully chosen by him, her opinions filtered through him, her presence merely an accessory to his. Tonight, she was here for herself. She wore a simple midnight blue velvet dress. It wasn't a designer gown dripping with this season's trends, but it hugged her form with an understated elegance that spoke of confidence rather than currency. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a loose chignon, a few errant curls framing a face that had regained a light Julian had spent years trying to extinguish. She wasn't here to mingle or be seen. She was here to see the new exhibit by her old mentor, Professor Albright, whose work was being honored. She had promised him she would be here, and Amelia always kept her promises. She clutched her small bag, her knuckles white. She knew Julian would be here. The thought had churned in her stomach all day, a cocktail of anxiety and dread. But avoiding him meant avoiding her own life, her own world, and she was done with that. She was rebuilding piece by piece, and part of that meant facing the ruins of her past without flinching. She moved along the periphery of the room, her artist's eye taking in the way the light hit a bronze sculpture, the subtle color palette of the paintings on the far wall. She felt a familiar pang, the ache of a passion she'd been forced to sideline. Julian had called her art a messy hobby, a cute distraction. He'd complained about the smell of turpentine and the cost of canvases, all while buying sterile mass-produced art as an investment. Suddenly, a familiar voice sliced through the din. Well, look what the cat dragged in." Amelia froze. Julian stood before her, his friends Mark and Jessica flanking him like well-dressed gargoyles. His smile was a predatory slash, his eyes raking over her simple dress with blatant disdain. "Amelia," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to turn their heads. "I have to say I'm surprised to see you here. Did you get lost on your way to a craft fair?" Mark snickered. Jessica offered a weak, uncomfortable smile. Amelia's face felt hot, the blood rushing to her cheeks. She straightened her spine. "Hello, Julian. I'm here to see Professor Albright's collection." "Ah, yes, the professor. Still clinging to those pipe dreams, are we?" He gestured around the room. "This is the big leagues, Mia. People here are buying art as assets, not as sentimental decorations for a dorm room." He turned to Mark. "She had this one painting, I remember, of a sunrise, so much orange. I think we used it as a coaster for a while before it mercifully disappeared." The lie was so bald-faced, so cruel it stole her breath. That painting had been her masterpiece, the one that had won her a fellowship. She'd given up because Julian was relocating for a major career opportunity. He had told her it had been damaged in a water leak in their storage unit. She felt the familiar shame wash over her, the feeling he had cultivated so expertly, the feeling of being small, untalented, and foolish. "Your dress is brave," Jessica chimed in, clearly, trying to fill the toxic silence, but only making it worse. Julian waved a dismissive hand. "Don't patronize her, Jessica. She's on a budget. We get it." He looked directly at Amelia, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hum. "Honestly, Mia, you shouldn't be here. You don't belong. You're out of your depth. You're alone. You look like you're about to cry. and frankly, it's embarrassing for both of us. He had her cornered. The whispers around them started to grow. People were watching the train wreck. Julian's public humiliation was a masterstroke of cruelty. He was cementing his narrative in real time, painting her as the pathetic ex-wife who couldn't let go. Every fibre of her being screamed at her to run to disappear back into the safety of her small Brooklyn apartment. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but her throat was tight with unshed tears. And at that exact moment, the noise of the gala seemed to dip, as if someone had slowly turned down the volume on the entire city. A collective hush fell over the room. The conversations, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a reverent silence. The grand doors at the entrance had opened again, and standing there, framed by the archway, like a figure stepping out of a film, was a man everyone in the room, and indeed the world recognized. It was Ethan Thorne, not just an actor, but the actor, the one with 2 Oscars, a reputation for being fiercely private, and a face that seemed to defy the very concept of aging. He was Hollywood royalty, but the kind that rarely attended such public events, making his presence all the more shocking. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored black suit, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone. He radiated a quiet intensity that commanded more attention than Julian's boisterous peacocking ever could. The air crackled with unspoken questions. Flashbulbs from the paparazzi still lingering outside erupted in a frenzy. Who was he here with? Why was he at the Blackwood Gala? Julian, for his part, was momentarily stunned into silence. His jaw hung slightly agape. This was a level of celebrity that dwarfed everyone in the room. Julian instantly began calculating, his mind racing. An introduction to Ethan Thorne could open doors he'd only dreamed of. Ethan's eyes, a startling shade of blue, scanned the room. They passed over the mayor, the heiresses, the tech moguls. He ignored the gallery owner, Mr. Blackwood, who was already making a beeline towards him. His gaze moved with purpose, searching, and then it stopped. His eyes locked onto Amelia. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that transformed his intense features into something warm and incredibly genuine. And then he started walking. He moved with an unhurried grace, a path miraculously clearing before him as people practically tripped over themselves to get out of his way. He walked past Julian, past Mark and Jessica without giving them so much as a glance. He walked directly to Amelia, who stood frozen, a deer in the headlights of an Aston Martin. He stopped an inch from her. The entire gala was now watching this silent, baffling play unfold. He reached out and gently took her hand. His voice, when he spoke, was low, meant only for her, but in the profound silence, it seemed to resonate through the hall. "Mia," he said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'm so sorry I'm late. The traffic was brutal. Have you been waiting long?" Amelia could only shake her head, her mind a complete blank. Ethan leaned in closer, his gaze flicking for a split second to a tear that had escaped and was tracing a path down her cheek. He gently wiped it away with his thumb. "Hey," he whispered, his eyes full of concern. "Are you okay?" She found her voice a small, shaky thing. "I am now." He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, and then turned, positioning himself slightly in front of her, a subtle shield between her and the world, specifically between her and Julian. He finally acknowledged Julian, Mark, and Jessica, but his warm expression had vanished, replaced by a cool, polite indifference. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice level but with an unmistakable edge of dismissal. "My date and I were hoping to see the Albright collection. If you'll excuse us." He didn't wait for a response. Keeping Amelia's hand firmly in his, he guided her away, leaving Julian standing there, his face a comical mask of shock, fury, and utter bewilderment. The whispers that had been about Amelia's pitiful state moments before, erupted into a firestorm of speculation. Who was she? How did she know Ethan Thorne? Julian watched them walk away, the superstar and his supposedly pathetic ex-wife, who now looked like the most enviable woman in the room. The scotch glass in his hand felt slick with sweat. The perfect narrative he had so carefully constructed had just been ripped to shreds in front of everyone who mattered. And the worst part, he had absolutely no idea how it had happened. As Ethan led her toward the quieter, less crowded wing of the gallery, where Professor Albright's work was displayed, Amelia felt as though she were floating through a dream. The judgmental stares that had pricked her skin moments ago had transformed into looks of awe and burning curiosity. She could feel Julian's glare like a physical weight on her back, but it was losing its power with every step she took away from him. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice still trembling slightly. "You have no idea what your timing just did." Ethan stopped in front of a large, moody landscape by her old professor. He turned to her, his expression serious. "I think I have some idea. I saw his face when I walked up. That man, he looks like he enjoys breaking beautiful things." His choice of words sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't say he looked like a jerk, or he seemed angry. He said he looked like he enjoyed breaking beautiful things. It was a poet's observation, an artist's observation. It was the most astute summary of Julian Croft she had ever heard. How did we, she stammered, still trying to connect the dots of this impossible reality. Just then, a flustered but beaming Mr. Blackwood, the gallery's silver-haired owner, finally caught up to them. "Mr. Thorne, what an absolute honor to have you here. I had no idea you were a collector." Ethan smiled politely, but kept his body angled toward Amelia. "I appreciate art, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm mostly here with my friend." He gestured to Amelia. "Mia, this is Arthur Blackwood. Arthur, this is Amelia Vance." Mr. Blackwood's eyes widened slightly. "Vance, of course. You were one of Albright's most promising students years ago. I remember your work from the university showcase. Absolutely breathtaking. What have you been up to?" Before Amelia could answer, Julian's voice would have echoed in her head, selling sketches in a coffee shop. But looking at Ethan, who was watching her with genuine expectation, she felt a flicker of her old self return. "I'm finding my way back to it," she said honestly. "Well, you must tell me how you two met." Blackwood said, his curiosity getting the better of him. "The whole city is dying to know." Ethan looked at Amelia, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a tiny nod. "It's not much of a Hollywood story." Ethan began, his voice drawing in a few nearby patrons who were pretending not to listen. "A few months ago, I was scouting locations in Brooklyn for an upcoming film. It was one of those miserable, rainy New York days. I ducked into the first place I saw to get out of the downpour, a little coffee shop called The Daily Grind." He paused, a nostalgic smile playing on his lips. "The coffee was terrible, to be honest. But on the wall there was this drawing. It was just charcoal on paper, but it stopped me in my tracks. It was a portrait of an old man sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons. But the way it was drawn, I could see his entire life in the lines on his face. The loneliness, the small joys, the defiance. It was the most honest thing I'd seen in years. It had a soul." Amelia felt her cheeks flush, remembering the drawing. She'd sketched it one afternoon in Washington Square Park. "I asked the barista who the artist was." Ethan continued, his eyes finding Amelia's. She pointed to a woman sitting in the corner, sketching in a notebook, completely lost in her own world. "She told me the artist's name was Mia." "I bought the drawing on the spot," he said, turning back to Mr. Blackwood. "And I asked the artist if she would have a coffee with me. A better coffee at a different place." He grinned. "We talked for 3 hours. About art, about life, about feeling like you've lost a piece of yourself and trying to find the courage to get it back." "I went back to that coffee shop every week," Ethan admitted. "And every week I'd buy another one of her pieces, My home in the Hollywood Hills is now decorated with the charcoal sketches of Amelia Vance, and I consider it the most valuable art I own." There was a stunned silence. Mr. Blackwood stared at Amelia with a newfound respect, his mind clearly reassessing her. She wasn't just a superstar's arm candy. She was the artist he was championing. The story wasn't about a celebrity saving a damsel in distress. It was about an artist discovering another artist, recognizing her raw, undeniable talent when she could barely recognize it in herself anymore. Amelia felt a profound sense of validation that was so much deeper than simple revenge. Julian had tried to humiliate her by mocking her art, and here was one of the most famous men in the world in front of the city's art elite, declaring that her messy hobby was the most valuable art he owned. The justice of it was exquisite. The story hung in the air, shifting the entire dynamic of the room. Amelia was no longer Julian Croft's pathetic ex-wife. She was Ethan Thorne's discovered artist. The whispers changed their tune from pity to intrigue. Who was this Amelia Vance? Where could they see her work? Julian had watched the scene unfold from a distance, his face darkening with every word of Ethan's story. This was a nightmare. He had orchestrated a public shaming, and it had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. His attempt to frame her as a failure had only served as the perfect dramatic setup for her triumphant reveal. He was no longer the star of the show. He was a footnote in a much more compelling story. Ego, however, is a resilient beast. Julian couldn't accept defeat. He saw Ethan's praise not as a testament to Amelia's talent, but as a personal affront, a challenge to his own judgment and status. He decided he had to reclaim control of the narrative. Pushing through the small crowd that had gathered, he approached Amelia and Ethan, a dangerously false smile plastered on his face. "What a charming little story," he boomed, trying to project an air of avuncular amusement. "Ethan, it's Julian Croft. It's a pleasure. I had no idea you were a fan of my ex-wife's little doodles." Ethan's polite facade dropped. His eyes became ice. He didn't extend a hand. "I'm a fan of great art, Mr. Croft. The size of the canvas or the price tag is irrelevant." Julian ignored the snub, placing a proprietary hand on Amelia's arm. She flinched and pulled away, but he pressed on his voice, dripping with condescension. "Isn't she something I taught her everything she knows about the art world, of course? Tried to get her to think bigger, but she always preferred the quaint stuff." He was trying to reposition himself as her former mentor, the one who had shaped her. It was a desperate, transparent ploy. "That's funny," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because from what Mia's told me, the only thing you taught her was to doubt herself. You taught her that her passion was worthless and her talent was an inconvenience." Julian's smile faltered. He was losing the room, and he knew it. He decided to double down on his cruelty, his last resort. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "She's always been overly sensitive. Can you believe," he said, turning to Mr. Blackwood, who was watching with a horrified fascination. "This woman used to be my wife. I spent a decade trying to give her the world, and she just wanted to sit in a room and make messes with charcoal. It's a little sad, isn't it?" Amelia felt a surge of white-hot fury, an anger so pure and potent, it burned away the last vestiges of her fear. For years she had swallowed his insults, absorbed his belittling remarks, and allowed him to shrink her world until it fit into the tiny box he'd designed for her. But she wasn't that person anymore. The woman who had sketched for hours in a coffee shop, pouring her soul onto paper, for no other reason than because she had to, was not weak. She had found her voice again, not just in her art, but in herself. "No, Julian," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through his tirade. "You know what's sad? What's sad is a man so insecure that he has to tear down everyone around him to feel tall. You didn't try to give me the world. You tried to take mine away from me." Julian was taken aback by her sudden defiance. He opened his mouth to retort, but Mr. Blackwood spoke first. "Ms. Vance," the gallery owner said, his tone now one of sincere professional interest. "Ethan mentioned your early work was quite different. More colour, larger canvases. I'd be very interested to see it, if any still exists." Julian let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Exists? Oh, you're not going to find any of that. I had to clear out all that clutter when she left. Most of it probably ended up in a landfill in New Jersey. Good riddance, I say. It was a fire hazard." He was trying to land one final killing blow to declare her past her most ambitious work as literal garbage. But in his arrogance, he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had just handed Amelia the one weapon she needed to end the war. Julian's harsh, barking laugh was a discordant sound in the opulent gallery, a noise as coarse and out of place as gravel in a champagne flute. He was trying to project an air of finality, of ultimate judgment, as if he were an auctioneer bringing the gavel down on the final pathetic lot of Amelia's artistic ambitions. The small crowd that had been drawn in by the magnetic pull of celebrity and confrontation now watched him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "Exists," he repeated, savouring the word, as if it were a fine vintage of cruelty. He gestured dismissively with his scotch glass, the amber liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Oh, you're not going to find any of that. You have to understand," he said, addressing Mr. Blackwood, but intending his words for the entire audience. "When a marriage ends, you have to fumigate. You have to clear out all the remnants, all the clutter." Amelia felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was his final act of erasure. He wasn't content to have diminished her in the present. He was now attempting to annihilate her past. Her early work, Julian continued, warming to his theme. It was all so collegiate, so earnest. He practically spat the word. Enormous canvases, gallons of paint. She had this obsession with sunrises of all things. So much orange and yellow. Garish, really. It took up an entire storage unit downtown, costing me a fortune every month just to house these giant dust collectors. He took a theatrical sip of his drink, letting the moment hang in the air. "So when she left, I had a choice. Pay a team of movers thousands of dollars to transport all that stuff to wherever she was squatting in Brooklyn, or make a clean break. I made the executive decision. A team went in, broke down the frames, and hauled it all away. Most of it probably ended up in a landfill in New Jersey by lunchtime the next day. Good riddance, I say. Frankly, the sheer volume of oil paint was a fire hazard." He smiled a tight, self-satisfied smirk. He believed he had landed the killing blow. He had declared her most ambitious work, the fruit of her most passionate years, as literal garbage. Something so worthless, it wasn't even worth preserving, so dangerous, it needed to be disposed of. He looked at her, expecting to see her shatter, to see the final flicker of defiance in her eyes die out. But Amelia didn't shatter. In that moment of supreme condescension, something within her solidified. The years of doubt he had so carefully cultivated fell away, replaced by a crystalline, chilling certainty. She thought of the painting, sunrise over the Hudson. She could feel the memory of its creation on her skin, the rough texture of the 7-foot canvas against her knuckles, the distinct, intoxicating smell of turpentine and linseed oil that clung to her clothes and hair for a year. She remembered the thrill of mixing the perfect shade of cadmium orange with titanium white to capture the hazy, ethereal glow of dawn breaking over the Palisades. She had poured her soul, her hope, her entire being onto that canvas. It was the physical manifestation of her talent, the thesis of her artistic life at that point. And he had just called it garbage. A strange, serene calmness settled over her. The frantic beating of her heart slowed to a steady, determined rhythm. She had him. He didn't know it yet, but in his desperate need to humiliate her, he had stumbled directly into the one perfectly laid trap she hadn't even known existed until this very second. "You're wrong, Julian," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the murmurs of the room with the precision of a scalpel. Every head turned towards her. Julian's smirk faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. It didn't end up in a landfill, she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Ethan, standing silently beside her, gave her hand a barely perceptible squeeze, a current of strength that flowed into her. He remained her silent witness, her anchor in the storm she was about to unleash. "You're talking about Sunrise over the Hudson, aren't you?" she continued, her gaze locked on his, refusing to let him look away. "The big one. The one I worked on every single day for 14 months. The one that Professor Albright submitted on my behalf to the Florence Art Institute. The one that got me the offer for the 2-year residency, a full scholarship." She let that detail land, watching the memory register on the faces of Mr. Blackwood and a few others who knew of the prestigious award. "And," she went on, her voice gaining strength with every word, "it was the one you told me was destroyed in a freak leak in our building's storage facility. You were so convincing, Julian. You described the call from the facility manager. You told me the plumbers said it was a 1 in a million pipe burst that flooded the entire floor. It was," Julian insisted, his bravado starting to sound brittle. "It was tragic. A complete disaster. The canvas was soaked, covered in mold and water damage. I saw the pictures. It was unsalvageable." "The pictures," Amelia mused, tilting her head slightly. "That's right. You told me the insurance company needed them for the claim, and that they were too graphic for me to see. You said you didn't want to break my heart all over again. How thoughtful of you." Her voice was laced with an irony so sharp it could draw blood. "You handled the entire insurance claim yourself, didn't you? You said it was too complicated, too much paperwork for my artistic temperament." Julian's face had gone from confident to tense. "I was trying to protect you. It was a painful time." "Oh, it was painful," Amelia agreed, a cold fire igniting in her eyes. "I mourned that painting like a living thing. I grieved for it. And I grieved for the future that was stolen from me. I turned down the Florence residency because the centerpiece of my portfolio, the very work that had earned me the spot, was gone. You held me while I cried, Julian. You told me I could always paint another one, knowing full well I was too broken to even try." The air in the gallery was thick with a terrible, riveting tension. The story had moved beyond a simple marital squabble. This was a tale of profound betrayal, a psychological drama unfolding in real time. "It's funny you should mention a pipe burst," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that forced everyone to lean in closer. "Because just last month I saw a picture of that painting." Julian's face, which had been pale, now seemed to drain of all colour, leaving a sickly, waxy sheen under the gallery lights. He looked like a man watching a guillotine blade begin its descent. "I was at the dentist's office," she said, the mundane detail making the revelation all the more devastating, "flipping through a magazine to calm my nerves. It was a back issue of Architectural Digest, and there it was, a 12-page spread. A Titan's Miami retreat inside the seaside sanctuary of financier Robert Kessler." She saw a flash of recognition and panic in Julian's eyes. Kessler, a major client, a whale. "And there on page 6 was my painting." Amelia's voice was now a resonant bell of truth, clear and unwavering. "My Sunrise over the Hudson. It was hanging in his living room, right above a massive white marble fireplace. It was the stunning centerpiece of the entire room. The light from the floor-to-ceiling windows hit it just so. It looked perfect, pristine. Not a drop of water damage on it, not a hint of mold. In fact," she added, delivering the final damning detail, the caption beneath the photo read, "A stunning contemporary landscape by an emerging artist acquired in 2016. She paused, letting the year sink in. 2016. "The very same year you told me it had been destroyed. The very same year you lost a fortune on that bad biotech stock investment. You needed cash, Julian. You needed it fast. So you didn't throw my painting in a landfill. You sold it. The accusation, now fully formed and backed by irrefutable evidence, hung in the air like a death sentence. Julian was completely exposed, his character stripped bare for all to see. He wasn't the magnanimous ex-husband. He was a petty, deceitful thief. He was a liar, a fraud, a man who had not only stolen a piece of art, but had callously, cruelly stolen his wife's future to cover his own failures. That's a lie, he stammered, his voice a hoarse croak. It's a ridiculous, hysterical accusation. She's delusional. He looked around wildly, seeking an ally, a friendly face, but found only a sea of cold, judgmental stares. Mark and Jessica had subtly shuffled several feet away, their faces masks of horror, as if trying to physically distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of his implosion. Is it a lie? Amelia challenged, her calm demeanor, making his frantic denial seem all the more pathetic. Robert Kessler is a very public figure. I'm sure Mr. Blackwood here knows how to contact him. He's a prolific collector. We could call him right now on speakerphone. Ask him when, and more importantly, from whom he acquired the painting. I'm sure a man like that keeps meticulous records. Provenance is everything. Isn't that what you always used to say? Julian, this was the final checkmate. There was no escape. Mr. Blackwood, who had been watching with an expression of deepening disgust, now stepped forward, assuming the role of executioner. His face was grim. Mr. Croft, he said, his voice resonating with the authority of a man who could make or break careers with a single phone call. In my world, a person's word is the bedrock of their reputation. An artwork's history, its provenance, is its soul. What Ms. Vance is suggesting, it's not just a marital dispute. It's a fundamental betrayal of trust that speaks to a profound and disqualifying lack of character. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his sleek black smartphone. And yes, I do have Mr. Kessler's private number. It will only take a moment. The sight of the phone in Blackwood's hand was Julian's breaking point. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a surge of pure animal panic. He was trapped, utterly and completely ruined. In this room where reputation was the only currency that truly mattered, he had just been declared bankrupt. He lunged forward, not at Amelia, but as if to snatch the phone from Blackwood's hand. He stopped himself just short, realizing the futility, the sheer indignity of the gesture. He looked at Amelia one last time, his eyes burning with a toxic mixture of pure hatred and abject shock. It was the look of a tyrant who had just watched a peasant lead a successful revolution. Then he turned and fled. He didn't walk. He didn't stride. He fled. He shouldered his way through the stunned crowd, his movements clumsy and graceless. He bumped into a passing waiter, sending a tray of empty champagne flutes crashing to the marble floor. The sound of shattering glass was the perfect punctuation mark for his obliterated reputation. No one moved to help. They just watched as Julian Croft, the self-proclaimed king, the master of his universe, practically ran from the gallery. A disgraced coward, disappearing into the New York night, leaving behind the beautiful thing he had tried and failed to break. In the deafening silence that followed Julian's chaotic exit, the sound of the last falling shard of glass seemed to hang in the air, a crystalline punctuation mark on a decade of lies. For a single suspended moment, the entire gallery was a tableau of shock. The murmur of the city outside, the clink of ice in a distant glass, the very hum of the building's ventilation, all of it seemed to have ceased holding its breath in the vacuum Julian had left behind. Amelia stood at the epicenter of that silence, feeling the last waves of adrenaline recede from her body, leaving a profound, unnerving calm in their wake. Her legs felt strangely light, as if they might forget how to hold her up. A metallic taste, the residue of pure righteous fury, lingered on her tongue. She had done it. She had unfurled the tightly coiled scroll of her truth and read it aloud to the world. Ethan moved from beside her to stand partially in front of her, a subtle and instinctive gesture of protection. His broad shoulders shielded her from the full force of 100 pairs of staring eyes, creating a small pocket of privacy in the vast marble hall. He didn't offer platitudes or congratulations. He simply took both of her trembling hands in his own hands, warm and steady. The simple, solid contact was an anchor, pulling her back into her own body. He leaned in, his voice a low murmur, meant only for her. "Breathe, Mia. Just breathe. You did it." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air feeling new in her lungs, clean and free of the cloying toxicity of Julian's presence. She had not just survived, she had prevailed. The spell that had held the room captive finally broke. The whispers began no longer the sharp, cruel hiss of gossip, but a low, rolling murmur of astonishment, and for the first time that night, respect. The narrative had not just been rewritten, it had been seized, torn to shreds, and resurrected under new authorship. She was no longer a footnote in Julian Croft's story. She was the headline of her own. Then a path began to clear through the crowd. It parted with the deference usually reserved for royalty or immense power, and through it walked a woman who embodied both in the New York art world. Eleanor Vance, the famously formidable senior critic for the New York Times, approached. She was a vision in architectural silver, her hair a sharp modern bob, her eyes missing nothing. She bypassed Ethan as if he were a handsome statue, her entire focus landing on Amelia. She stopped and placed a surprisingly gentle, cool hand on Amelia's forearm. "What he did," Eleanor said, her voice a low, gravelly instrument that had eviscerated lesser artists for decades, "was a crime of the soul. Unforgivable." She paused, her gaze intense. "But what you just did, the courage it took to stand in your truth, unadorned and unapologetic, that was a work of art in itself. In a world of fakes, forgeries, and carefully constructed images, an act of pure, unvarnished truth is the rarest and most precious thing. I've seen 100 artists with talent, my dear. I've seen perhaps 10 with that kind of fire. The fire is what lasts. Don't you ever let anyone extinguish it again." Amelia, stunned by the endorsement, could only manage a choked, "Thank you." Nearby, Jessica Mark's wife hovered awkwardly, her face pale with a mixture of shock and vicarious shame. "Amelia," she stammered, wringing her hands. We had no idea. He always said, I'm so sorry." Amelia looked at the woman who less than an hour ago had patronizingly called her dress brave. She saw not an enemy, but a casualty of Julian's orbit, another person who had accepted his narrative without question. Amelia gave her a cool, distant nod. "Thank you, Jessica," she said, the words polite but clear. The conversation was over. That chapter was closed. It was then that Mr. Blackwood stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury and professional purpose. "Eleanor is right," he declared, his voice cutting through the remaining chatter. "Amelia, may I have a word with you and Mr. Thorne in my office? I believe we've provided enough of a public spectacle for one evening." He led them through a discreet door concealed behind a towering bronze sculpture, ushering them into a sanctuary of quiet elegance. His private office was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with art history tomes and auction catalogues. Smaller, more personal paintings hung on the walls, works by artists he truly loved, not just those he sold. The sudden profound peace was a balm to Amelia's frayed nerves. Mr. Blackwood closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the last vestiges of the gala's noise, and gestured for them to sit on a plush, charcoal-grey leather sofa. He sat in a large armchair opposite them, his demeanour shifting from gallery owner to strategist. "Amelia," he began, his tone direct and serious. "First, an apology. Julian Croft has been a patron of this gallery for years. I pride myself on my judgment of character, and tonight I was shown to be a fool. I assure you, he will never be welcome in this establishment again." "I appreciate that," Amelia said, her voice regaining its strength. But this is no longer about him, Blackwood asserted, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with a shrewd, focused light. This is about you and about your art. What he did selling your painting under fraudulent pretenses, lying about its destruction to manipulate you both personally and professionally, is not just a moral outrage. It is almost certainly a jailable offence. It is fraud clear and simple. He steepled his fingers. My gallery retains one of the best arts law firms in the country, specializing in provenance and recovery. First thing tomorrow morning, we will begin proceedings. Our lawyers will file an injunction to prevent the sale or movement of Sunrise over the Hudson. We will contact Robert Kessler's counsel directly. It will be delicate, but the evidence, the magazine article, the date of publication, your direct testimony is overwhelmingly in your favor. The threat of a very public, very ugly scandal will likely make Mr. Kessler's team extremely cooperative. Men like him and Julian despise messes. We will get your painting back. The words washed over Amelia a wave of impossible hope. To see her painting again, her lost masterpiece, her stolen future, it was more than she had allowed herself to dream of. But that, Mr. Blackwood, said his voice quickening with an electric excitement, is only the beginning. An artist's story is part of their art. And your story, a lost masterpiece, a silenced artist who finds her voice and brings a titan to his knees. It is the stuff of legend. It's a narrative of resilience of an artist silenced and then reborn. It's magnificent. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on her. The fall season begins in 4 months. I've just had an unexpected and now very convenient opening in my schedule for the headline exhibition. The spot is yours if you want it. A solo show. Amelia Vance's Resurrection. We will build the entire exhibition around the recovery of Sunrise. We'll contrast the raw monochrome honesty of your recent charcoal work with the explosive color of your past. We won't just display your art, Amelia. We will tell your story, and the entire world will listen. The offer hung in the air, immense and terrifying and beautiful. A solo show at the Blackwood. It was everything she had ever wanted. And a voice, Julian's voice, slithered into the back of her mind, a final desperate act of psychological warfare. You can't do it. You're a one-hit wonder, Mia. That painting was a fluke. You don't have the discipline for a real show. You haven't picked up a brush in years. You'll choke. You'll fail. And everyone will see that I was right all along. She felt a wave of cold terror, the familiar fear of failure that he had so expertly conditioned in her. Her hands resting in her lap, clenched into fists. She could fail. He could be right. He'll say you can't do it. Ethan said, his voice a calm, steady counterpoint to the venom in her head. He was watching her face, reading the conflict in her eyes. He'll say anything he can to keep you small because your talent terrifies him and your strength eviscerates him. The only voice that matters right now, Mia, is yours. What do you say? Amelia looked down at her own hands. She saw the faint, dark stains of charcoal etched into the cuticle stains that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. Julian had called them messy, but they weren't messy. They were the marks of a creator. They were the proof that even when he had taken her color, her confidence, and her masterpiece, he could not take the artist. The artist had survived. The artist had worked. The artist was still here. She looked up, and the fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cool, clear resolve. I'll need a significant advance, she said, her voice not just steady, but resonant with a newfound authority. Not just for supplies, but to cover 6 months of living expenses. I will not create my best work if I'm worried about next month's rent. She met Mr. Blackwood's gaze. And I'll need a proper studio. Immediately. With north-facing light. She was no longer accepting a gift. She was negotiating as a professional. A slow, wide grin of pure delight spread across Mr. Blackwood's face. Of course, he said, extending his hand. Whatever you need. Welcome to the Blackwood Gallery, Miss Vance. We have a great deal of work to do." As she shook his firm, dry hand, the office door creaked open. Professor Albright stood there, his kind, wrinkled face a roadmap of concern. "Amelia, they told me you were in here." I heard the commotion. "Are you all right, my dear?" Seeing him, her first mentor, the man who had always nurtured her talent without an agenda, was the final emotional release. The tears she had held back all night finally came. Not tears of pain, but of overwhelming gratitude. She crossed the room, and he enveloped her in a hug that smelled of pipe tobacco and turpentine, the foundational sense of her artistic life. "All right," he chuckled, pulling back to hold her by the shoulders, his old eyes shining with pride. "My dear girl, you are formidable. I always knew the artist in you was a lion. That man just tried to convince you that you were a kitten." He beamed at her. "Now tell me about this new work. The charcoal pieces Ethan has described to me. He says they have a soul. What have you been exploring in the darkness?" "Amelia, I thought I'd lost my color, Professor." She explained, the words coming easily now. "So I focused on the lines. On form, on shadow, on the truth you see when you strip everything else away. I wasn't exploring darkness. I was just learning to see in it." They talked for a while longer, making plans before Amelia and Ethan finally prepared to leave. As they walked back out into the main gallery, the crowd had thinned to only a few stragglers. The atmosphere was quiet, reverent. Those who remained watched her pass, their expressions changed. They nodded respectfully. They saw her. Stepping out of the climate-controlled gallery and into the warm, humid embrace of the August night felt like being born. The city air, thick with the smells of roasted nuts and exhaust fumes, had never felt so clean. The cacophony of sirens and distant music had never sounded so much like a symphony. The city was no longer Julian's playground. It was her canvas. A taxi glided to the curb, and Ethan opened the door. As she slid inside, he followed the cab, pulling away into the river of traffic. "The first time I saw you," Ethan said, his voice soft in the relative quiet of the cab. "In that coffee shop, you had this look on your face when you were sketching. It was the same look you had tonight when you confronted him. Fierce, focused, like the rest of the world didn't exist. That's the artist, Mia. That's who you've always been." "Thank you, Ethan," she said, turning to him, her heart filled with a gratitude so immense it felt like a physical presence. "Not for saving me, but for seeing me. When I was starting to forget what I looked like, you saw me." The cab reached a crossroads, the light turning red. The driver grunted. "Where to, folks?" One direction led towards the bridge to Brooklyn, to her small apartment to sleep to tomorrow. The other led deeper into the sleepless heart of Manhattan. Amelia knew that a choice was a beginning. Her new life couldn't wait for morning. It didn't need a formal studio or a signed contract. It needed a single decisive act of creation. She leaned forward. "Take us to the 24-hour art supply store on 13th Street, she said, her voice ringing with a joyful, unshakable purpose. She leaned back against the seat, a genuine, brilliant smile lighting up her face. In her mind's eye, she was already there. She could smell the sharp, clean scent of gesso and paper, could feel the satisfying weight of a new tube of oil paint in her hand. She could see the rows upon rows of colors, a glorious, infinite spectrum of possibility. Cadmium orange, phthalo blue, alizarin crimson. She had been living in a world of charcoal and shadow, but she had never forgotten the language of light. "I have a new sunrise to paint," she whispered, as much to herself as to Ethan. And as the cab made the turn, plunging into the glittering electric heart of the city that was now hers, she knew with every fiber of her being that this was the dawn. Amelia's story isn't just about revenge. It's a powerful reminder that your worth is not determined by someone else's opinion. Julian tried to write her story for her to cast her as a failure in his grand narrative of success. But he forgot one crucial detail: she was the artist. She held the pen, the charcoal, the brush. She had the power to create her own reality, to paint her own masterpiece. Her triumph wasn't in arriving with a superstar on her arm, but in finding the strength to speak her truth and reclaim her own talent. The superstar was just the spotlight that finally allowed the world to see the brilliance that was there all along. What did you think of Amelia's incredible journey back to herself? Have you ever had a moment where you had to stand up and reclaim your own story? Let us know in the comments below. If you were inspired by Mia's strength and refusal to be silenced, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner power, and make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for listening.